Hello and welcome to Dreamtime History. Imagine a people who thrived across Europe and Western Asia for over 300,000 years. They mastered fire, crafted sophisticated tools, and cared for their injured and elderly. They survived countless ice ages, adapted to shifting climates, and built lives of quiet resilience in a world far harsher than our own. These were the Neanderthals, our closest evolutionary cousins, and by every measure of prehistoric success, they were remarkable survivors. And then, around 40,000 years ago, they began to disappear. Not in a single catastrophic event, but gradually, like footprints slowly erased by an incoming tide. Today, we know that some of their genetic legacy lives on within us, woven into our very DNA. But the people themselves, their cultures, their voices, all of this vanished from the earth. So what really happened to the Neanderthals? Was it climate change, competition with our own ancestors, disease, or something far more subtle? How does a lineage that endured for millennia simply fade away? Tonight we will explore one of prehistory's most haunting mysteries. But before we begin our journey, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. So I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. Before we can understand what happened to the Neanderthals, we must first step back into a world that existed long before anyone had ever heard that name. Before German quarry workers found strange bones in a limestone cave in 1856. Before scholars argued over skulls and jaw fragments in gaslit lecture halls. Before the word Neanderthal entered our vocabulary, carrying with it decades of misunderstanding and caricature. We must journey to a time when these people simply lived, breathed, and made their quiet way through landscapes that would be utterly foreign to us today. Imagine, if you can, the vast sweep of deep time, not the hurried centuries of recorded history, but the patient millennia that shape continents and carve valleys. We are speaking of a span so immense that our entire civilization, from the first cities of Mesopotamia to the present moment, would represent merely the final few pages of a very long book. The Neanderthal lived not in the brief flicker of human memory, but in geological time itself. Their lineage took root in Europe and Western Asia around 400,000 years ago, when the world was a fundamentally different place. This was an Earth in constant, restless motion. Where you might expect stability, there was endless change. Ice sheets advanced and retreated like slow-breathing giants, covering vast territories in grinding white silence, then melting back to reveal scraped bedrock and scattered boulders. Coastlines shifted with each climatic pulse. Forests gave way to grasslands, which surrendered in turn to tundra, which eventually welcomed back the trees in an endless cycle of transformation. Rivers changed course, mountains rose grain by grain, and through all of this planetary restlessness the Neanderthals endured. They were not, as we so often imagine them, crude approximations of humanity stumbling through a brief prehistoric interlude. They were a successful human lineage, shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of European and Asian environments into something both familiar and distinct. Their story spans roughly 10 times the entire duration of agriculture, 20 times longer than the age of cities, 100 times longer than the industrial era. If we think of human history as a single day, the Neanderthals lived through the morning, afternoon and evening, vanishing only as night began to fall. Consider what it means to persist across such temporal vastness. 1,000 generations might pass beneath the same limestone cliffs, each learning from the last, each adapting to the subtle shifts in climate and terrain. Children grew to adulthood in landscapes their great-grandparents would have recognized, yet different enough to demand new solutions, new knowledge, new ways of seeing. This was not the static world of popular imagination, where primitive peoples supposedly lived unchanging lives in eternal repetition. This was a world of constant, patient innovation. The geographic scope of their success tells its own story. From the Atlantic shores of Portugal to the windswept steppes of western Siberia, from the Mediterranean warmth of southern Italy to the harsh tundra edges of northern Europe, Neanderthal communities established themselves across a landscape of stunning diversity. They were not confined to a single valley or a favoured region, but spread across a territory larger than modern Europe, adapting their lives to pine forests and oak woodlands, to coastal plains and mountain valleys, to the margins of advancing glaciers and the grasslands that followed in their wake. Each of these environments demanded its own expertise. The skills needed to thrive beside the Mediterranean were not identical to those required on the northern plains. The seasonal rhythms of Atlantic Europe differed from those of continental Asia. Yet somehow, across all these varied landscapes and climates, Neanderthal communities found ways to flourish. They developed regional traditions while maintaining the deeper continuities that marked them as a distinct people. They faced down ice ages that would have challenged any human lineage and emerged from each climatic trial still present, still adapting, still learning. This endurance, this sheer persistence across time and space, represents a form of success that our modern world rarely recognizes. We are accustomed to thinking of achievement in terms of expansion, acceleration, and conquest. We measure progress by the speed of change and the scale of our constructions. But in the deep past, success was measured differently. It was counted in generations survived, in knowledge preserved and transmitted, in the quiet maintenance of communities across the long centuries of climatic uncertainty. The Neanderthals were not building pyramids or founding empires. They were doing something far more fundamental and perhaps far more difficult. They were staying alive, staying human, staying connected to each other and to their landscapes through changes that would test any form of life. They were mastering the art of endurance in a world that offered no guarantees, no safety nets, no institutions to fall back upon when the environment shifted beyond recognition. When we speak of the Neanderthals, then, we are not speaking of a failed experiment or an evolutionary dead end. We are speaking of one of the great success stories in human history, a people who found ways to live well across vast territories and enormous spans of time, who faced challenges that would humble any modern society, and who persisted through it all with a resilience that commands our deepest respect. Their story is not a cautionary tale about inadequacy. It is a meditation on what it truly means to thrive in an uncertain world. To understand the Neanderthals, we must first dispel the most persistent myth that has clung to them like frost to stone. In our collective imagination, they have become cartoon figures, hulking brutes with sloped foreheads and dragging knuckles, grunting their way through a crude existence that was somehow less than fully human. This caricature, born in the earliest days of paleoanthropology and nurtured by decades of misinterpretation, has proven remarkably resistant to evidence. But the truth, as revealed by careful study of their remains, tells a very different story. The Neanderthals were not failed attempts at humanity. They were successful specialists, shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of European winters into something both powerful and precise. Consider the environment that forged them. Europe during the Pleistocene was not the temperate garden we know today, but a land locked in conversation with ice. Glaciers advanced and retreated in vast grinding cycles, each pulse bringing its own demands for adaptation. When the ice sheets expanded, they carried with them a burden of cold that transformed entire continents. Temperatures that would challenge our most sophisticated modern survival gear became the everyday reality for anyone hoping to live and raise children in such a world. The Neanderthals did not simply endure these conditions, they mastered them. Their bodies tell the story of this mastery. Where we might see primitive robustness, anatomy reveals elegant specialization. The Neanderthal frame was indeed heavier and more muscular than our own, but this was not crudeness, it was engineering. In the physics of survival, body mass becomes a crucial variable in the equation of warmth. A compact, powerful build conserves heat more efficiently than the lean frame that serves as well in temperate climates. Their barrel chests housed larger lungs, capable of warming the frigid air before it reached delicate internal tissues. Their shorter limbs reduced the surface area exposed to killing cold while maintaining the strength needed for the demanding work of Ice Age life. These adaptations came with costs that we are only now beginning to appreciate. A larger, more muscular body demands more fuel, more calories, more constant attention to the basic mathematics of energy. While our own ancestors developed the lean efficiency that would eventually carry them across deserts and tropical savannas, the Neanderthals committed to a different strategy, one that prioritized survival in the world they knew over adaptability to environments they had never encountered. It was a reasonable choice, perhaps even an inspired one given the challenges they faced. But it was also a choice that bound them to specific landscapes and specific ways of life. The question of intelligence, so often raised in discussions of Neanderthal capabilities, reveals our own biases more clearly than it illuminates their reality. When we examine their cranial capacity, we find something that should humble our assumptions about the relationship between brain size and cognitive ability. Neanderthal skulls often housed brains that were as large as our own, and in many cases significantly larger. Some specimens reveal cranial capacities that exceed the modern human average by 10 to 15%. If brain size were a simple measure of intelligence, the Neanderthals would emerge as our intellectual superiors. But intelligence, as we are slowly learning, is not a matter of sheer neural volume. It is a complex interplay of organization, connectivity, and cultural transmission that cannot be reduced to cubic centimeters of tissue. What their brain size does tell us is something more subtle and more important. It reveals a lineage that was investing heavily in cognitive capability, that was meeting the challenges of their environment not just with muscle and bone, but with sophisticated mental processing. The demands of Ice Age survival were not merely physical. They required memory, planning, and the ability to read subtle environmental cues across vast seasonal cycles. They demanded the kind of intelligence that could track game across varied terrain, predict weather patterns, and coordinate complex social behaviors within small groups, where every individual's contribution was essential for survival. The energetic cost of maintaining such large brains in such robust bodies created what we might call a metabolic burden. Neanderthals lived under a constant pressure to find sufficient calories not just to fuel their muscular frames, but to power the neural networks that made their sophisticated behaviors possible. This was not a weakness, it was the price of their particular form of excellence. Every adaptation in evolution involves trade-offs, and the Neanderthal trade-off was clear. They chose power and intelligence over efficiency, specialization over generalization, mastery of their environment over adaptability to new ones. This energetic reality shaped every aspect of their lives. It influenced their hunting strategies, their social organization, and their relationship with the landscape. It meant that they could not afford the luxury of inefficiency, that every calorie had to be carefully obtained and wisely used. It meant that their technologies had to be not just adequate, but optimized for their specific needs and capabilities. It meant that their social bonds had to be strong enough to ensure cooperation in the demanding work of survival, but flexible enough to respond to the constant environmental pressures that defined their world. When we understand the Neanderthals in these terms, as successful specialists rather than failed generalists, their achievements become all the more remarkable. They were not struggling to become something they were not. They were perfecting what they were, developing into a form of humanity that was exquisitely adapted to the challenges they faced. Their story is not one of inadequacy, but of a different kind of excellence, shaped by different pressures and expressed through different solutions to the fundamental problems of human existence. In the quiet corners of museums around the world, stored in numbered boxes and sorted by site and layer, lie thousands upon thousands of stone fragments that most visitors would dismiss as meaningless debris, broken chips of flint and chert, cores reduced to their last useful form, blades snapped in ancient use. To the untrained eye, they appear to be little more than the accidental byproducts of random violence, stones smashed against stones in some prehistoric frenzy of destruction. But to those who have learned to read their subtle language, these fragments tell a different story entirely. They speak of patience, planning, and a sophisticated understanding of how force travels through crystalline structures. They reveal minds that could envision the hidden tool within the raw nodule and possessed the skill to coax it into existence through hundreds of precisely calculated strikes. This is the world of lithic technology, the ancient art of stone working that formed the technological foundation of Neanderthal life. It was not, as popular imagination would have it, a matter of crude bashing one rock against another until something sharp emerged. It was a discipline as refined as any craft, demanding years of training, acute spatial intelligence, and an intimate knowledge of stone that could only come from generations of accumulated wisdom. When we examine the tools left behind by Neanderthal communities, we are looking at the products of what archaeologists call the Middle Paleolithic tradition, and specifically at technologies that reveal planning, foresight, and cultural transmission of remarkable sophistication. Consider what it means to work stone with intention. You must first understand the internal structure of your raw material, how it will fracture, where the stress will concentrate, which angles will produce the clean, sharp edges you require. Different stones behave differently. Flint knaps with predictable precision, while quartzite demands different techniques entirely. Obsidian, when available, yields edges sharper than surgical steel. but it is brittle and requires delicate handling. The stoneworker must know all of this before the first strike is made, must be able to read the quality and potential of a nodule through subtle signs that would be invisible to the uninitiated. The Neanderthals had mastered what modern researchers call prepared core technology, a system that reveals planning of extraordinary depth. Rather than simply striking flakes from a stone until it was exhausted, they would first carefully shape the core itself, creating a precise geometric form that would yield flakes of predetermined size and shape. This preparation might involve dozens of preliminary strikes, each one designed not to produce a tool, but to set the stage for tools that would come later. It was like preparing a printing press, complex initial work that would allow for the efficient production of multiple standardized products. The most sophisticated of these techniques is known as the Levallois method, named after the Parisian suburb where it was first recognized by archaeologists. This approach required the napper to envision the finished flake before beginning work, then to systematically remove material from around its borders, creating a carefully prepared striking platform that would release the desired tool with a single, perfectly placed blow. It was stoneworking as sculpture, requiring the ability to see the finished product hidden within the raw material and the technical skill to reveal it without waste or error. When archaeologists examine the debris left behind by these ancient workshops, they can reconstruct not just the tools that were made, but the entire sequence of decisions that led to their creation. Each discarded flake preserves the angle and force of the blow that created it. The scars left on cores record the order in which material was removed. It becomes possible to follow the thought process of craftsmen who lived 40,000 years ago, to see where they encountered problems, how they adapted their technique, and what level of skill they had achieved. This archaeological detective work reveals patterns that speak to cultural transmission, the passing of knowledge from experienced practitioners to novices. The variations in technique visible at different sites suggest regional traditions, local innovations, and the kind of stylistic preferences that can only emerge when basic technical competence has been mastered and artisans begin to express individual approaches within established frameworks. These are not the random productions of untrained hands, but the works of specialists operating within coherent technological systems. Yet for all the sophistication these tools represent, we must be careful not to overinterpret what they can tell us. Stone preserves remarkably well, which is why it dominates the archaeological record of this period. But stone tools were almost certainly just one component of much more complex technological systems that have largely vanished from the record. Wooden handles and hafts, leather wrappings, organic adhesives, all of these would have been essential elements of Neanderthal technology, but they rarely survived the passage of millennia. We are seeing only the durable skeleton of their material culture, not its full living form. The tools themselves suggest uses that extended far beyond the simple cutting and scraping that stone implements can accomplish on their own. Many show wear patterns consistent with woodworking, suggesting sophisticated wooden tools and structures that we can only guess at. Others bear traces of having been hafted to handles, indicating composite tools that combined multiple materials into integrated systems. The stone components that survive may represent only a fraction of the technological sophistication that characterized Neanderthal daily life. What emerges from this careful analysis is a picture of technological competence that demands respect. These were not primitive beings stumbling toward more advanced techniques, but accomplished craftsmen working within established traditions that had been refined across countless generations. Their stone tools represent not the crude beginnings of human technology, but a mature and successful approach to the fundamental challenge of creating reliable, effective implements from the materials their environment provided. In the deepest layers of archaeological sites across Europe and Western Asia, researchers have found something that speaks to us across the vast span of time more intimately than any stone tool or bone fragment. Scattered through the ancient sediments, mixed with the debris of daily life, lie tiny fragments of charcoal, microscopic traces of ash, and the subtle chemical signatures of combustion. These are the remains of fires that burned tens of thousands of years ago, and they tell us something profound about the Neanderthal relationship with one of humanity's most transformative technologies. Fire, for these ancient people, was not the dramatic symbol of civilization that it has become in our collective imagination. It was something far more fundamental and far more complex. It was domestic infrastructure. Think of fire not as a conquest or a discovery, but as a constant companion that demanded attention, care, and deep understanding. For the Neanderthals, mastering fire meant mastering a living technology that required feeding, tending, and careful management across the changing seasons and shifting demands of nomadic life. It was a relationship as complex and essential as that between a farmer and the soil, requiring knowledge that could only be accumulated across generations and passed down through patient instruction and daily practice. The evidence for controlled fire use among Neanderthal populations extends far back into their timeline, reaching depths that speak to the antiquity of this partnership. At sites like Kesem Cave in Israel and Schöningen in Germany, researchers have found hearth structures and burned materials that suggest fire management was already a mature technology hundreds of thousands of years ago. These are not the tentative experiments of newcomers to pyrotechnology, but the confident applications of a skill that had been refined across millennia of use. But understanding what fire meant to these ancient communities requires us to slow down and consider the texture of daily life around the hearth. Imagine the constant awareness required to maintain a flame through the long nights and changing weather of Ice Age Europe. Someone had to know which woods burned cleanest, which dried fastest, which produced the most heat with the least smoke. Someone had to understand how to bank coals so they would survive the night, how to revive them in the morning, how to transport embers safely when the group moved to new locations. The hearth became far more than a source of heat and light. It was the gravitational centre around which daily activities organised themselves. Here, beside the steady warmth of burning wood, stone tools could be heated to improve their knapping qualities. Wooden implements could be hardened in the flames, their points charred to create durable, sharp edges that would hold their shape through hard use. Hides could be processed with the help of fire, warmed to make them more pliable, or exposed to smoke to preserve them against decay. Cooking, perhaps the most obvious application of controlled fire, transformed not just the nutritional value of food, but the social rhythms of the group. Raw meat and fibrous plant materials that would challenge any digestive system became tender and accessible through the application of heat. The nutrients locked within tough cellular structures became available for absorption. But more than this practical benefit, cooking created time. Time when the group gathered around the hearth while food prepared itself. Time for the quiet conversations and patient instruction that bind communities together across generations. The archaeological record suggests that Neanderthal groups practiced a kind of seasonal mobility that took them through varied landscapes as resources and climate demanded. This was not aimless wandering, but purposeful movement that followed established patterns refined through deep familiarity with regional environments. Fire technology had to be portable, adaptable to different fuel sources and shelter situations. The hearth was not a permanent installation, but a temporary arrangement that could be established quickly and efficiently wherever the group chose to pause in their seasonal rounds. Caves, when available, provided natural advantages for fire management. The stone walls reflected heat back into living spaces, conserving precious fuel. Natural chimneys and air circulation patterns helped manage smoke. The protection from wind and weather made it easier to maintain consistent temperatures. But we must be careful not to imagine these cave sites as permanent homes in our modern sense. They were more like seasonal camps or temporary refuges, occupied for days or weeks at a time before the group moved on to other locations in their territorial rounds. Each occupation left traces that accumulated over time, creating the layered deposits that archaeologists study today. Charcoal fragments mixed with bone scraps and stone tool debris, ash layers that mark individual fires, the chemical signatures of combustion preserved in sediments. These sites become archives of repeated use, recording not single dramatic events, but the quiet accumulation of ordinary days around countless hearths. The management of fire also required sophisticated understanding of risk and safety. An uncontrolled flame could destroy valuable equipment, injure group members, or attract unwanted attention from predators or competing groups. Fire had to be contained, monitored, and extinguished with the same care that went into kindling it. The person responsible for maintaining the hearth carried knowledge that was essential to group survival, making them a crucial member of the community regardless of their other contributions to hunting or tool-making. In the evening hours, as darkness settled over the landscape and the sounds of daytime activity faded into quiet, the hearth became something else entirely. It was a pool of warmth and light that held the human world together against the vast indifference of night. Here, around the steady glow of burning wood, the Neanderthals maintained their humanity through the long hours of darkness, sharing the close quarters and quiet companionship that knit small groups into resilient communities. Fire was not just technology for them, it was the hearth around which their social world was built, the steady flame that made human life possible in a challenging and often hostile world. The pale light of dawn is filtering through the entrance of the limestone shelter where you have spent the night. Around you, the small group that forms your world is beginning to stir, 8 adults and 3 children, bound together by kinship, necessity, and the deep familiarity that comes from sharing survival across the changing seasons. This is not the dramatic awakening of legend, no heroic rising to face mythical challenges, but something far more fundamental, the quiet beginning of another ordinary day in a life measured by practical necessities and small, careful decisions that will determine whether the group prospers or struggles in the days to come. Your first awareness is of the cold air against your face, carrying the sharp scent of frost and the distant promise of snow. The fire that warmed you through the night has burned low, reduced to a bed of glowing coals that still radiates precious heat. Someone, perhaps it was you, perhaps another member of the group taking their turn at this essential task, must have risen in the darkness to feed it, adding carefully selected pieces of wood to maintain the warmth that keeps the small human circle alive in this vast, indifferent landscape. Now, in the growing light, you can see the breath of your companions condensing in small puffs as they begin to move, stretching muscles that have grown stiff from the night's rest. The day's first task is always the same, assessing what the group needs and what the environment might provide. You rise slowly, your body reminding you of yesterday's work in the familiar ache of muscles that have carried heavy loads across difficult terrain. Around you, others are making the same quiet transition from sleep to wakefulness, their movements economical and purposeful. There is no unnecessary haste here, no urgent rushing toward arbitrary goals. Each action grows from genuine necessity, shaped by the accumulated wisdom of countless previous mornings when such decisions determined the difference between comfort and hardship. The fire needs attention first. You select pieces of dry wood from the carefully maintained store gathered yesterday evening, adding them to the coals with the practiced precision that comes from years of experience. Too much fuel too quickly will create smoke without heat. Too little will let the precious warmth dissipate before the day's cooking is done. The flames respond to your attention, growing stronger and cleaner, casting a steadier light into the shelter's recesses where your few possessions lie carefully arranged. Your tools are arranged within arm's reach, stone implements whose edges you will examine this morning with the critical eye of someone whose life depends on their effectiveness. The wooden hafted scraper that serves so many purposes will need its binding checked and perhaps re-wrapped with fresh sinew. The carefully shaped points that tip your spears require inspection for cracks or chips that could mean the difference between a successful hunt and a dangerous failure. This is the archaeology that does not preserve well, the organic technology that formed the backbone of daily life, but vanishes from the record, leaving only the stone components that archaeologists recover millennia later. As the group fully awakens, the day's activities begin to organize themselves around the practical demands that never disappear. Someone must gather fuel for tonight's fire, not just any wood, but the right kinds. Dry hardwood that burns cleanly, softer woods that ignite easily, bark and tinder that can be kept ready for emergency fire starting. Someone must check the condition of the group's few precious containers, leather bags and wooden bowls that represent hours of careful work and cannot be casually replaced. Someone must evaluate the weather signs that will determine whether this is a day for travel, for hunting, for the intensive work of processing hides, or for the maintenance tasks that accumulate during busier times. The children, even the youngest who can barely walk steadily, are learning through constant observation and gentle participation. They watch how you select stones for the firing, how you test the edge of a blade against your thumb, how you read the signs in the sky that speak of weather changes still hours away. Their education is not formal instruction, but patient demonstration, quiet correction, and the gradual assumption of responsibility as their skills develop. In a group this small, Every person's competence matters. There is no room for purely decorative members or extended periods of non-contribution. The morning meal, when food is available, is simple but carefully managed. Meat from yesterday's hunt, if there was a successful hunt, warmed by the fire and shared according to needs that everyone understands. Plant foods gathered by those who know which roots and leaves can be safely eaten, which require special preparation, which provide the vitamins and nutrients that meat alone cannot supply. Water, collected from sources that experience has proven safe and reliable. Each element of this meal represents knowledge accumulated across generations, tested by survival and refined through countless repetitions. As the day develops, the group will make the decision that shapes everything else, whether to move or to remain in place. This choice depends on dozens of factors that you weigh with the unconscious skill of long practice. The weather signs, the availability of local resources, the condition of the group members, the time of year, and the seasonal movements of the animals you depend on. The proximity of other groups, whether friendly or potentially threatening. These calculations happen largely beneath the level of conscious thought, emerging from a deep familiarity with the rhythms and requirements of this specific landscape at this specific time of year. If the group moves today, the morning will be spent in the careful packing that ensures nothing essential is left behind and nothing unnecessary slows the day's travel. If you remain, the day will organize itself around the work that camps require: tool maintenance, hide processing, the gathering of materials that might be needed in the days ahead. Either way, your day will unfold within the constraints and possibilities that define this ancient way of life, shaped by decisions that blend practical necessity with the accumulated wisdom that keeps small groups alive across the long centuries of Ice Age uncertainty. When we think of Neanderthal subsistence, our modern imagination often conjures dramatic scenes borrowed from countless nature documentaries. Bands of hunters charging across open plains in pursuit of massive woolly mammoths, bringing down giants through raw courage and primitive cunning. This romanticized vision, compelling as it may be, obscures a far more interesting and sophisticated reality. The Neanderthals were not specialized big-game hunters, locked into a single strategy for survival. They were flexible opportunists who understood their landscapes with an intimacy that allowed them to extract sustenance from whatever sources their environment provided, adapting their methods to local conditions, seasonal availability, and the unpredictable variables that shaped daily life in Ice Age Europe. The archaeological evidence paints a picture of remarkable dietary diversity. At coastal sites, we find the remains of shellfish and marine resources that speak to communities comfortable working the tidal margins, timing their gathering with the rhythms of the sea. In forested regions, the bone assemblages include smaller game, rabbits, birds, and the varied fauna that thrived in woodland environments. At sites near rivers and lakes, fish bones and the tools associated with aquatic hunting reveal yet another dimension of Neanderthal adaptability. This was not random opportunism, but systematic exploitation of whatever resources each specific environment offered. Even when they did hunt large game, the reality was far removed from the heroic charges of popular imagination. Hunting was logistics. It was patient observation of animal behavior, accumulated over seasons and years until every migration route, every watering place, every seasonal feeding ground was mapped in memory and shared among the group. It was understanding which animals were most vulnerable at which times of year, how weather patterns affected their movements, and where they could be approached with the greatest chance of success and the least risk of injury. Risk management was perhaps the most crucial aspect of this equation. In a world without emergency medical care or social safety nets, an injury that might seem minor by modern standards could easily become fatal. A sprained ankle that prevented effective hunting or foraging, a deep cut that became infected, a broken bone that never healed properly. For people living in small groups where every individual's contribution was essential, the cost of injuries had to be weighed carefully against the potential benefits of any hunting strategy. This fundamental reality shaped every aspect of how they approached the procurement of food. Cooperation was not simply preferable in this context, it was mathematically necessary. A solitary hunter, no matter how skilled, faced odds that were simply unacceptable given the stakes involved. But a coordinated group could surround prey, drive animals toward natural barriers, or create situations where one person's mistake did, not doom the entire enterprise. They could carry injured hunters to safety, share the physical burden of transporting meat across difficult terrain, and ensure that knowledge was preserved even if individual specialists were lost to accident or illness. The evidence suggests hunting strategies that were remarkably sophisticated in their planning and execution. At sites like Schöningen in Germany, archaeologists have discovered wooden spears of extraordinary craftsmanship, balanced weapons clearly designed for throwing, with points carefully shaped and hardened by fire. These were not crude implements hastily fashioned in moments of need, but specialized tools that represented significant investments of time and skill. The very existence of such weapons implies hunting strategies that could justify their creation and maintenance. But perhaps the most revealing evidence comes not from the weapons themselves, but from the patterns of how prey animals were processed after successful hunts. The distribution of butchery marks on bones tells stories of systematic dismemberment that followed established procedures. Certain cuts were made first to access the most nutritious organs, others followed to separate major muscle groups for easier transport, still others served to extract marrow from long bones, or to prepare hides for the complex process of leather making. These patterns reveal communities that understood anatomy with the precision of professional butchers, that had developed standardized methods for processing carcasses efficiently, and that possessed the tools necessary to perform complex dismemberment in the field. This was not desperate scavenging, but systematic resource extraction that maximized the value obtained from every successful hunt, while minimizing the time spent in potentially dangerous activities. The archaeological sites where this evidence is found represent something quite different from what we might expect. They are not ancient dining rooms where complete meals were consumed, but processing stations where specific tasks were performed as part of larger subsistence strategies. A site might preserve evidence of initial butchery, where a large animal was broken down into transportable portions. Another might show signs of secondary processing, where meat was further divided for distribution among group members. Still others reveal the specialized work of hide preparation, tool maintenance, or the extraction of raw materials for future use. Understanding this distinction between a site and a meal helps us appreciate the complexity of Neanderthal resource management. Food procurement was not a simple matter of killing animals and eating them where they fell. It was a sophisticated system of planning, execution, processing, and distribution that required coordination among multiple individuals and extended across both space and time. Success in this system depended not just on the skills of individual hunters, but on the accumulated knowledge of the community, the maintenance of specialized equipment, and the careful management of risk across all aspects of the subsistence cycle. This systematic approach to food procurement reveals cognitive capabilities that demand our respect. These were people who could plan complex operations involving multiple participants, who understood the behavior of numerous prey species, who had developed specialized techniques for everything from tracking to butchery, and who possessed the social cohesion necessary to coordinate their efforts across the extended time periods that successful hunting required. They were not primitive opportunists grabbing whatever they could find, but sophisticated resource managers operating within complex systems that had been refined across countless generations of accumulated experience. In the scattered debris of archaeological sites across Europe, mixed among the familiar stone tools and charcoal fragments, researchers sometimes find small, dark lumps of material that would be easy to overlook. To the untrained eye, they appear unremarkable, bits of blackened organic matter, perhaps the residue of ancient cooking fires or the remnants of decayed wood. But when subjected to chemical analysis, these humble fragments reveal themselves to be something far more significant. The preserved remains of one of humanity's earliest synthetic materials. They are pieces of birch bark tar, a sticky, waterproof adhesive that Neanderthal craftsmen created through a process so sophisticated that modern experimental archaeologists struggle to replicate it reliably. The creation of birch tar represents a technological achievement that challenges our assumptions about the complexity of prehistoric innovation. This was not a simple matter of heating bark over an open fire until it became sticky. The production of high-quality adhesive required precise control of temperature and atmosphere, careful selection of raw materials, and an understanding of chemical processes that could only have been developed through generations of experimentation and refinement. The maker had to know exactly which species of birch to use, at what time of year to harvest the bark, and how to create the specific conditions of heat and oxygen deprivation that would transform the raw material into a durable, workable glue. Modern attempts to recreate this ancient technology have revealed just how demanding the process actually was. Experimental archaeologists have tried various methods, from simple heating over open fires to more complex systems involving buried pots and carefully regulated combustion. The results have been mixed at best. Too much heat, and the bark simply burns to ash. Too little, and it remains unchanged. The wrong atmospheric conditions and the chemical transformation that creates the adhesive properties simply does not occur. Success requires not just theoretical knowledge, but the kind of practical expertise that comes only from repeated experience and careful attention to subtle details that cannot be easily communicated through words alone. The implications of this technological sophistication extend far beyond the simple fact that Neanderthals could make glue. The production of birch tar suggests planning capabilities that reached well into the future, because the primary purpose of this adhesive was not immediate use, but the creation of composite tools that would serve the group's needs across extended periods. A carefully hafted spear point secured to its wooden shaft with birch tar and wrapped with sinew became something greater than the sum of its parts, a reliable hunting weapon that could withstand the stresses of repeated use while remaining repairable when components eventually failed. This transition from simple to composite tools represents a fundamental shift in technological thinking. A stone blade used by itself is sharp and effective, but it is also brittle and difficult to control precisely. Hafted to a wooden handle with adhesive, the same blade becomes part of an integrated system that amplifies human capability while reducing the risk of injury to the user. The wooden handle provides leverage and control. The adhesive creates a secure bond that can nevertheless be deliberately broken when maintenance is required. The result is not just a better tool, but a different kind of tool, one that anticipates its own eventual failure and incorporates solutions for repair and renewal. The archaeological evidence suggests that Neanderthal groups were creating and maintaining entire tool systems based on this composite approach. Spear points were not just attached to shafts, but could be removed and replaced when they broke or dulled. Knives could be rehafted to new handles when the originals wore out or cracked. Scrapers could be adjusted in their mountings to expose fresh cutting edges as the working surfaces became worn. This was technology designed not for single use, but for maintenance, adaptation, and long-term reliability in the hands of mobile groups who could not afford to constantly manufacture replacement tools. The knowledge required to sustain such systems was necessarily communal. No single individual could master all the skills involved in locating appropriate birch trees, harvesting bark at the optimal time, controlling the complex heating process, selecting suitable wood for handles, shaping stone components to precise specifications, and understanding the subtle techniques of assembly and maintenance. This knowledge had to be distributed among group members and transmitted from experienced craftsmen to novices through patient demonstration and guided practice. The teaching of such skills created what we might call technological traditions, bodies of shared knowledge that existed not in any written form, but in the collective memory and practiced competence of the community. These traditions had to be robust enough to survive the inevitable losses that would occur when skilled individuals died or when groups were forced to relocate to unfamiliar territories. They had to be flexible enough to accommodate local variations in available materials, while maintaining the essential principles that ensured successful results. When we find traces of birch tar at archaeological sites, we are therefore looking at evidence of much more than individual technological competence. We are seeing the material residue of complex social systems that could sustain and transmit sophisticated technical knowledge across generations. We are glimpsing communities that thought systematically about the relationship between immediate needs and long-term requirements, that invested time and energy in creating solutions that would serve them well into an uncertain future. The quiet invention of glue, mundane as it might appear beside the more dramatic technologies that capture popular imagination, represents one of the crucial innovations that allowed human communities to extend their capabilities beyond the limitations of individual strength and simple tools. In the patient work of Neanderthal adhesive makers, carefully tending their fires and monitoring their chemical transformations, we see the beginnings of humanity's long relationship with synthetic materials and engineered solutions to practical problems. Among the most compelling evidence for the depth of Neanderthal humanity lies not in their tools or technologies, but in the careful examination of bones that tell stories of survival against overwhelming odds. In the limestone caves and rock shelters where these ancient people once sought refuge, archaeologists have uncovered skeletal remains that speak to something profound about the nature of their communities. These are not the bones of individuals who lived solitary lives and died alone, but the remains of people who survived catastrophic injuries that should have been fatal, who lived for years and even decades with disabilities that would have made independent survival impossible. Their bones are archives of care, testament to communities that valued their members not simply for their productive contributions, but for their essential humanity. The most famous of these cases comes from Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, where in the 1950s and 60s, archaeologist Ralph Solecki uncovered the remains of several Neanderthal individuals who had lived and died in this sheltered place. Among these discoveries, one skeleton in particular has captured the attention of researchers for decades. Known simply as Shanidar I, this individual lived sometime between 45 and 50,000 years ago, and his bones tell a story that challenges every crude stereotype about prehistoric brutality and the supposed callousness of ancient peoples. The catalogue of injuries preserved in this skeleton reads like the medical record of someone who had endured multiple severe traumas over the course of a long life. His right arm had been severely damaged, probably crushed, and had healed in a way that left it withered and largely useless. His right leg bore evidence of a fracture that had mended improperly, leaving him with a pronounced limp that would have affected his mobility for the remainder of his life. Most remarkably, examination of his skull revealed that he had been blind in his left eye, possibly from birth, and may have suffered additional head trauma that affected his cognitive capabilities. Any one of these conditions would have presented serious challenges for survival in the demanding world of Ice Age Eurasia. Together, they painted a picture of an individual who could not have hunted large game, could not have travelled easily across difficult terrain, could not have contributed to many of the physically demanding tasks that kept small groups alive in harsh environments. By the crude calculus that we often imagine governed prehistoric life, survival of the fittest, every person for themselves, the ruthless elimination of anyone who could not pull their own weight, this individual should have died soon after his injuries occurred. Instead, the evidence suggests that he lived for many years after his disabilities were acquired. The bone healing patterns indicate long periods of recovery and adaptation. The wear patterns on his remaining teeth suggest that he continued to eat regular meals, rather than subsisting on whatever scraps others might have spared. The very fact that his skeleton was found in association with other Neanderthal remains, in a cave that showed signs of repeated occupation over long periods, suggests that he remained an integral part of his community until his death from natural causes, in what appears to have been advanced old age. The implications of this survival extend far beyond the individual case. Someone had to help him obtain food when he could not hunt or forage effectively for himself. Someone had to assist him in moving from place to place when the group's seasonal migrations demanded travel across difficult terrain. Someone had to ensure that he was included in the group's activities, that he remained warm during cold nights, that his basic needs were met day after day, season after season, year after year. This was not emergency assistance provided during a brief crisis, but sustained support that continued across what may have been decades of dependence. Modern discussions of this case have been careful to avoid the kind of romantic sentimentality that once led researchers to imagine elaborate scenarios of Neanderthal compassion and proto-religious devotion to the elderly and disabled. Contemporary scholars approach the evidence with appropriate caution, recognizing that care can take many forms and emerge from many different motivations. What they call care might have been simple pragmatic recognition that every group member possessed knowledge and experience that could benefit the community, even if their physical contributions were limited. It might have reflected kinship obligations that were honoured regardless of personal cost. It might have emerged from emotional bonds that made abandonment unthinkable. But regardless of the specific motivations involved, the basic fact remains. This individual's survival required sustained cooperation from others in his group. It required a social system sophisticated enough to accommodate members who consumed resources without producing equivalent returns in traditional economic terms. It required communities that could find ways to value individuals for contributions that extended beyond immediate physical productivity. In small groups where every calorie mattered and every decision carried potentially fatal consequences, this kind of sustained support represents a form of social organisation that deserves our deepest respect. The Shanidar I case is not unique. Other Neanderthal sites have yielded evidence of individuals who survived severe injuries, who lived with significant disabilities, who required and apparently received assistance from their communities across extended periods. Each case adds to our understanding of social systems that were far more complex and humane than the brutal stereotypes that have dominated popular imagination for so long. What emerges from this evidence is a picture of Neanderthal communities bound together not just by the immediate necessities of survival, but by deeper bonds of mutual obligation and care. These were groups that understood resilience not as individual toughness, but as collective responsibility. They recognized that in a world full of dangers and uncertainties, today's hunter might become tomorrow's dependent, that today's contributor might become tomorrow's burden, and that the strength of the community lay not in its ability to cast aside the weak, but in its capacity to find ways for everyone to contribute according to their abilities and to receive support according to their needs. In the same limestone cave where we encountered the story of sustained care preserved in ancient bones, archaeologists made another discovery that would spark decades of debate about the emotional and spiritual lives of Neanderthal communities. This find emerged not from dramatic excavation or sudden revelation, but from the patient sifting of sediments that had accumulated over tens of thousands of years. Mixed within the dark earth that surrounded one particular skeleton, researchers found something unexpected: concentrations of flower pollen that seemed far too abundant and too specifically distributed to represent random natural accumulation. The skeleton in question belonged to an adult male who had been laid to rest in what appeared to be a deliberately prepared shallow depression in the cave floor. The position of the bones suggested that the body had been placed there intact, rather than scattered by scavenging animals or natural processes. The surrounding sediments showed none of the chaotic mixing that would be expected if the remains had been disturbed by geological activity or repeated cave occupation. Everything about the burial context suggested intentional human activity, a community that had chosen to treat their dead with care and ceremony. But it was the pollen evidence that transformed this archaeological find into something far more emotionally resonant. Laboratory analysis revealed concentrations of flower pollen that represented multiple species: yarrow, cornflower, bachelor's button, St. Barnaby's thistle, ragwort, grape hyacinth, and hollyhock. These were not the few scattered grains that might drift into a cave on random air currents, but substantial quantities that seemed to cluster around and beneath the skeletal remains. The species represented were not wind-pollinated plants that might accidentally accumulate in cave environments, but flowers that would have required deliberate gathering and placement. The initial interpretation of this evidence captured imaginations around the world. Here, researchers suggested, was proof that Neanderthals possessed the capacity for symbolic thought, for ritual behavior, for the kind of emotional responses to death that we consider fundamentally human. The image that emerged was deeply moving. Grieving family members gathering armfuls of wildflowers to create a final resting place of beauty and meaning for their departed loved one. It was a vision that challenged every stereotype about primitive brutality and suggested depths of feeling that bridged the vast temporal gulf between their world and ours. This romantic interpretation held sway for decades, supported by the apparent uniqueness of the find and the compelling narrative it offered. The flower burial became a touchstone in discussions of Neanderthal humanity, evidence that these ancient people shared our capacity for grief, our need to mark the passage from life to death with ceremony and meaning. Popular accounts embraced the story enthusiastically, finding in it confirmation of universal human values that transcended species boundaries and geological epochs. But archaeology, at its best, is a self-correcting discipline that subjects even its most cherished interpretations to ongoing scrutiny. As techniques for analysing ancient pollen became more sophisticated, and as researchers gained a better understanding of how organic materials move through cave environments over long periods, questions began to emerge about the flower burial hypothesis. Alternative explanations for the pollen concentration started to seem not just possible, but perhaps more probable than the original interpretation. Modern palynologists, scientists who study ancient pollen, pointed to several factors that could account for the unusual concentrations without requiring human agency. Small burrowing animals, particularly the Persian geode, were known to collect flowers and store them in underground caches as food reserves. These rodent hordes, when abandoned or disturbed, could create exactly the kind of pollen concentrations found at the burial site. The specific flowers represented in the pollen assemblage were precisely those that these animals preferred to gather and store. The timing of pollen deposition also raised questions about the original interpretation. Detailed analysis of the sediment layers suggested that at least some of the pollen concentrations might have been introduced after the burial itself, possibly centuries or even millennia later. The geological processes that shape cave environments over long periods could easily redistribute organic materials, creating artificial associations between human remains and plant materials that had no original connection. These alternative explanations do not represent attacks on Neanderthal humanity or attempts to diminish their cognitive capabilities. Rather, they reflect the careful skepticism that good archaeology demands, the recognition that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the understanding that our desire to find familiar human behaviours in the past can sometimes lead us to overlook simpler, more prosaic explanations for unusual findings. The broader question of Neanderthal burial practices extends far beyond this single controversial case. At sites across their range, archaeologists have found evidence that suggests deliberate treatment of the dead, though this evidence varies considerably in its clarity and interpretation. Some skeletal remains show signs of having been intentionally placed in protected locations. Others are associated with what appear to be grave goods, stone tools, or animal bones that may have been deliberately included with the deceased. Still others show evidence of post-mortem processing that might represent ritual activity or simply practical responses to the challenges of disposing of bodies in small living spaces. What emerges from this complex and sometimes contradictory evidence is a picture of communities that clearly distinguish between the living and the dead, that developed consistent practices for dealing with mortality, but that may have expressed these practices in ways quite different from our own expectations. The absence of elaborate grave goods or monumental architecture does not indicate absence of ritual or meaning. The failure to find clear evidence of flower burials does not negate the possibility of other forms of ceremony that leave no archaeological trace. The story of the Shanidar flower burial, whether ultimately confirmed or refuted by future research, serves as a powerful reminder of both the possibilities and the limitations of archaeological interpretation. It shows us how desperately we want to connect with our ancient relatives across the vast expanse of time, and how easily that desire can shape our reading of ambiguous evidence. It demonstrates the importance of maintaining scientific rigor even when dealing with questions that touch our deepest emotions about what it means to be human. Of all the questions that surround the vanished world of the Neanderthals, perhaps none is more haunting than the silence that has settled over their voices. We can reconstruct their tools, analyse their bones, map their territories, and infer their daily routines from the debris they left behind. But the sounds they made to each other across firelit caves and windswept plains, the words they spoke, the songs they might have sung, the conversations that bound their communities together, these have vanished as completely as smoke rising from their ancient hearths. We are left with only anatomical clues and tantalizing possibilities, fragments of evidence that hint at communication systems we can never fully recover. The search for Neanderthal language capabilities has led researchers down pathways that require extraordinary caution. Unlike stone tools or burned bones, language leaves no direct archaeological trace. We cannot excavate conversations or carbon date vocabulary. Instead, we must approach this most human of capabilities through indirect evidence, the shape of vocal tracts, the structure of neural pathways, the subtle arrangements of bone and cartilage that make speech possible. Each clue must be evaluated carefully, its implications weighed against the fundamental uncertainty that surrounds any attempt to reconstruct something as complex and ephemeral as spoken communication. The most famous piece of evidence in this detective story emerged from Kebara Cave in Israel, where archaeologists uncovered the remarkably preserved skeleton of a Neanderthal individual who lived approximately 60,000 years ago. Among the bones recovered from this burial was a small, horseshoe-shaped structure that rarely survives in the archaeological record, the hyoid bone. This delicate piece of anatomy, suspended in the soft tissues of the throat, plays a crucial role in human speech production. It anchors the muscles that control the tongue and larynx, providing the fine motor control that allows us to produce the complex range of sounds that form the building blocks of human language. The Kebara hyoid, when compared to modern human specimens, showed remarkable similarities in size, shape, and structure. This discovery generated considerable excitement among researchers, since it suggested that at least some of the anatomical prerequisites for speech were present in Neanderthal populations. Here, seemingly, was physical evidence that these ancient people possessed the basic hardware necessary for complex vocal communication. The implications appeared profound. If Neanderthals could produce the range of sounds that human speech requires, then perhaps the gap between their world and ours was not as vast as previously imagined. But the presence of appropriate anatomy does not automatically translate into the presence of language as we understand it. The relationship between the physical capacity for speech and the cultural system of language is far more complex than early researchers realized. Modern humans possess not just the anatomical structures that make speech possible, but also the neural networks that organize sounds into meaningful patterns, the cognitive frameworks that allow abstract concepts to be encoded in vocal symbols, and the social systems that transmit these complex codes from generation to generation. Language, in its full human form, is not simply the ability to make a wide range of sounds. It is a layered system of extraordinary sophistication that combines phonology, grammar, syntax, and semantics into a tool for transmitting not just immediate practical information, but abstract concepts, hypothetical scenarios, past events, and future possibilities. It allows us to share not just what we observe directly, but what we imagine, what we remember, and what we hope. This kind of communication system emerges not from anatomy alone, but from the intersection of physical capability with cultural evolution across many generations. The evidence for Neanderthal language capabilities must therefore be evaluated with appropriate humility. We can identify anatomical structures that would have made speech possible, but we cannot determine what kinds of sounds they actually produced, how those sounds might have been organized into systematic communication, or how closely their vocal interactions resembled what we would recognize as language. We are dealing with possibilities rather than certainties, with tantalizing hints rather than definitive proof. Moreover, human communication has never been limited to vocal expression alone. Even in our own species, which possesses arguably the most sophisticated language system that has ever evolved, much of our daily communication happens through gesture, facial expression, body posture, and shared contextual understanding. A raised eyebrow, a subtle hand movement, a particular way of arranging objects, all of these can convey complex information without requiring a single spoken word. The Neanderthals, living in small groups where everyone knew everyone else intimately, would have developed rich systems of non-vocal communication that could supplement whatever vocal capabilities they possessed. The transmission of technical knowledge, which we know occurred successfully across Neanderthal communities and generations, provides another window into their communication capabilities. The sophisticated stoneworking techniques we explored earlier could not have been transmitted through simple imitation alone. They required systematic instruction, correction of errors, and the kind of patient demonstration that implies at least some capacity for intentional teaching. Whether this instruction involved what we would recognize as language, or whether it relied on other forms of communicative interaction, we cannot determine. But the successful preservation and transmission of complex technical knowledge across generations suggests communication systems that were effective, systematic, and culturally stable. The silence that surrounds Neanderthal voices serves as a reminder of the limitations that constrain all archaeological interpretation. There are aspects of the human past that remain forever beyond our reach, questions that we can approach but never fully answer, mysteries that our evidence can illuminate but never completely solve. In confronting these limitations, we learn not just about the ancient people we study, but about the nature of knowledge itself and the quiet humility that should accompany our efforts to understand lives that were lived and voices that were stilled tens of thousands of years before our own species learned to write their stories down. When we attempt to understand the final chapters of the Neanderthal story, we must first abandon one of our most persistent misconceptions about the world they inhabited. In our collective imagination, the Ice Age appears as a single, monolithic period of cold, a vast frozen epoch where glaciers advanced steadily southward, temperatures dropped uniformly, and the landscape transformed into an unchanging wasteland of ice and tundra. This vision, dramatic as it may be, bears little resemblance to the complex climatic reality that shaped the lives of Neanderthal communities across their final millennia of existence. The truth revealed by decades of careful study of ancient ice cores, lake sediments and pollen records tells a very different story. The climate of late Pleistocene Europe was not a gradual slide into frigid uniformity, but a restless, flickering system of rapid transitions between warm and cold phases that could transform entire landscapes within the span of human generations. These were not slow geological changes that unfolded over tens of thousands of years, but abrupt oscillations that could alter the fundamental character of regional environments within decades or even years. Scientists have given a name to these dramatic climate swings, Dansgaard-Oeschger events, after the researchers who first identified them in Greenland ice cores. These cycles reveal a pattern of sudden warming followed by gradual cooling, repeated dozens of times across the period when Neanderthals were struggling to maintain their presence in an increasingly challenging world. Each cycle could bring temperature changes of 10 degrees Celsius or more, transformations that would reshape vegetation communities, alter the distribution of prey animals, and force human populations to adapt or abandon territories their ancestors had occupied for millennia. Imagine the implications of such changes for communities that depended on intimate knowledge of their local environments. A group that had developed sophisticated strategies for exploiting the resources of a particular valley might find their world transformed within their own lifetimes. Forests that had provided reliable supplies of game and plant foods could give way to open grasslands that supported entirely different species. Rivers that had flowed predictably for generations might change course or disappear entirely as precipitation patterns shifted. Coastal areas that offered rich marine resources could become inaccessible as sea levels rose or fell with the advance and retreat of distant ice sheets. These environmental oscillations created what researchers call a mosaic landscape, a complex patchwork of habitable and uninhabitable zones that shifted constantly as climate conditions changed. During warm phases, temperate forests might extend far to the north, creating corridors of rich habitat that could support relatively large populations. But when cold conditions returned, these same areas could become harsh tundra or even ice-covered wasteland, forcing any human inhabitants to retreat to more favourable refuges or face extinction. The concept of refugia, small areas that retained favourable conditions even during harsh climatic phases, becomes crucial for understanding how both animal and human populations survived these repeated environmental crises. The southern peninsulas of Europe, Iberia, Italy, the Balkans, served as these refugial areas, their Mediterranean climates buffered by proximity to the sea and protected by mountain ranges from the worst effects of northern cooling. Here, in scattered pockets of relatively stable habitat, remnant populations could survive the worst climatic episodes and potentially expand again when conditions improved. But refugia, by their very nature, could support only small populations. As habitable areas contracted during cold phases, the carrying capacity of the landscape diminished dramatically. Groups that had thrived in expansive territories during warm periods found themselves compressed into marginal areas where resources were limited and competition intense. The social networks that had connected distant communities became stretched and broken as the intervening territories became uninhabitable. Populations that had once exchanged knowledge, genes, and cultural innovations found themselves isolated in scattered pockets, separated by vast expanses of hostile terrain. This fragmentation created what population biologists call metapopulation dynamics, patterns of local extinction and recolonization, as small groups struggled to survive in marginal habitats, while maintaining tenuous connections with distant relatives. Some local populations would inevitably fail during particularly harsh episodes, their accumulated knowledge and genetic diversity lost forever. Others might survive but remain isolated for so long that they diverge culturally and biologically from their distant cousins. Climate change in this context was rarely a direct killer of Neanderthal populations. Rather, it served as what researchers term a pressure multiplier, a factor that amplified other stresses and made survival more difficult in countless subtle ways. It reduced the availability of familiar resources, forcing groups to develop new subsistence strategies or expand into less favourable territories. It disrupted the social networks that allowed knowledge and assistance to flow between communities. It increased the frequency of environmental crises that tested the adaptive capabilities of small populations already living close to the margins of survival. The restless climate of late Pleistocene Europe created a world of constant adjustment and readjustment, where success depended not just on the ability to exploit familiar environments, but on the capacity to adapt quickly to changing conditions, while maintaining the social cohesion that made survival possible in small groups facing uncertain futures. In the mathematics that govern survival, numbers can become destiny. This is a truth that operates beneath the surface of more dramatic narratives, invisible to casual observation but inexorable in its effects. For the Neanderthals, scattered across the challenging landscapes of Ice Age Eurasia, the simple arithmetic of population size would eventually prove as decisive as any environmental pressure or external threat. Small groups, no matter how skillful or well adapted, face vulnerabilities that large populations can absorb without consequence. In the quiet calculus of demographic fragility, brilliance and resilience offer no protection against the mathematical realities that govern the survival of the isolated communities. The genetic evidence recovered from Neanderthal remains tells a story that becomes clearer with each new analysis, each additional specimen that allows researchers to peer deeper into the population dynamics of these ancient communities. What emerges is a picture of groups that were not just small in absolute terms, but increasingly isolated from each other as climatic pressures and geographical barriers disrupted the social networks that had once connected distant relatives across vast territories. The DNA extracted from their bones reveals signatures that population geneticists recognize as the hallmarks of demographic stress: reduced diversity, increased inbreeding, and the genetic bottlenecks that occur when effective population sizes shrink below critical thresholds. These patterns are not immediately obvious to the casual observer. A group of 30 individuals might seem substantial enough to maintain itself indefinitely, particularly if its members are skilled, cooperative, and intimately familiar with their environment. But the mathematics of small populations operate according to principles that can be counterintuitive to minds shaped by experience with larger social groups. In populations that number in the hundreds or thousands, random events that affect individual survival tend to average out across the group as a whole. But in populations that number in the dozens, these same random events can have disproportionate and cumulative effects that compound over generations. Population biologists have given a name to one of the most insidious of these effects: genetic drift. This is the process by which random variations in survival and reproduction gradually alter the genetic composition of small populations, independent of any selective advantage or disadvantage. In large populations, drift operates slowly, and its effects are usually overwhelmed by natural selection. But in small populations, drift can become the dominant force shaping genetic change, causing the random loss of genetic variants that might be crucial for adaptation to future environmental challenges. The consequences of genetic drift extend far beyond abstract changes in gene frequencies. As genetic diversity declines, populations become increasingly vulnerable to environmental changes that their ancestors might have weathered successfully. They lose the flexibility that comes from maintaining multiple genetic solutions to survival challenges. They become more susceptible to diseases that might have affected only a portion of a more diverse population. They face increased risks of genetic disorders that arise when harmful recessive traits become more common due to mating among increasingly related individuals. Researchers studying the later Neanderthal populations have found evidence of exactly these kinds of problems. Some groups show genetic signatures consistent with severe inbreeding, suggesting that they had become so isolated that individuals had little choice but to mate with close relatives. Others reveal genetic patterns that indicate their effective population sizes had shrunk to levels that would have made long-term survival problematic even under favourable conditions. These are the mathematical signatures of populations under severe demographic stress, communities that were struggling not just with immediate environmental challenges, but with the fundamental arithmetic of small group survival. The isolation that contributed to these genetic problems was itself the product of the environmental pressures we explored in the previous chapter. As climate oscillations fragmented habitable landscapes into scattered refugia, Neanderthal populations found themselves separated by increasingly vast stretches of uninhabitable terrain. Groups that had once exchanged individuals and genetic material on a regular basis became cut off from each other for generations at a time. The social networks that had allowed knowledge and assistance to flow between communities became attenuated and eventually broken entirely. This isolation created what population biologists call alley effects, situations where small population size itself becomes a factor that reduces the survival chances of individuals within the group. In very small populations, it becomes difficult to find mates, difficult to maintain the specialized knowledge that complex survival strategies require, and difficult to weather the inevitable crises that affect all communities over time. These effects can create a positive feedback loop where declining population leads to reduced survival rates, which in turn leads to further population decline. The picture that emerges from this demographic analysis is not one of sudden catastrophe, but of gradual erosion. Neanderthal populations may not have vanished in dramatic collapses, but rather through a slow process of thinning and fragmentation that played out across centuries and millennia. Groups that had maintained themselves successfully for generations gradually lost the demographic robustness that had made such persistence possible. They became increasingly vulnerable to the kinds of random events and environmental challenges that their ancestors had survived repeatedly. This demographic vulnerability represents a form of extinction that operates according to different rules than the dramatic scenarios often imagined in popular accounts. It requires no sudden environmental catastrophe, no overwhelming external enemy, no single decisive failure of adaptation. Instead, it emerges from the quiet mathematics of small numbers, the inexorable arithmetic that governs survival in a world where being few and becoming fewer eventually becomes a problem that even the most capable communities cannot solve. Around 50,000 years ago, in the shifting landscapes of Western Asia and southeastern Europe, a threshold was quietly crossed. The archaeological record, with its patient accumulation of stone tools and hearth sites, begins to register the presence of a new kind of human community in territories that Neanderthals had called home for hundreds of thousands of years. These newcomers brought with them their own traditions of tool-making, their own strategies for survival, their own ways of organizing social life around the fundamental challenges of existence in demanding environments. They were our own ancestors, anatomically modern humans who had begun a long journey from their African origins into the wider world beyond. This was not the dramatic collision of civilizations that popular imagination often constructs around such momentous encounters. There were no massed armies clashing on ancient battlefields, no sudden invasions that swept established populations from their ancestral lands in a matter of years or decades. Instead, the arrival of modern humans in Neanderthal territories appears to have been a gradual process of expansion and infiltration that played out across many centuries, involving groups that were often small, widely scattered, and probably as concerned with the basic challenges of survival as with any grand conquest of new lands. The genetic evidence suggests that the most significant period of contact between these two human lineages occurred roughly between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago, with the peak of interaction falling somewhere around 47,000 years in the past. But these dates, precise as they may appear, represent broad averages derived from complex statistical analyses of DNA patterns that persist in modern human populations. The actual history of contact was almost certainly far more complicated, involving multiple waves of migration, temporary expansions followed by local extinctions, and regional variations that created a mosaic of interaction patterns across the vast territories where both groups struggled to maintain their presence. Some of the early modern human populations that entered Europe and Western Asia may have left no descendants at all. The archaeological record hints at what researchers call population turnover, episodes where groups established themselves in new territories for extended periods, only to disappear entirely as environmental conditions changed or as other challenges proved insurmountable. This pattern of advance and retreat, colonization and abandonment appears to have characterized the early stages of modern human expansion into regions that Neanderthals had occupied for millennia. The modern humans who eventually established lasting populations in these territories brought with them cultural and technological traditions that differed in subtle but significant ways from those of their Neanderthal contemporaries. Their stone tool industries showed different approaches to blade production, different strategies for creating specialized implements, different solutions to the basic problem of extracting sharp, durable edges from raw stone. Their settlement patterns, insofar as these can be reconstructed from fragmentary archaeological evidence, suggest different relationships with the landscape, different calculations about mobility and resource exploitation, different social arrangements that shaped how groups organize themselves across space and time, but we must be careful not to overstate these differences or to interpret them through the lens of inevitable progress toward more advanced ways of life. The cultural distinctions between Neanderthals and early modern humans were variations on common themes rather than fundamental differences in capability or intelligence. Both groups faced similar environmental challenges. Both developed sophisticated technologies for dealing with the demands of Ice Age survival. Both created complex social arrangements that allowed small communities to persist across generations in demanding landscapes. The differences between them were more like regional dialects of a common human language than fundamental incompatibilities that made peaceful coexistence impossible. The territories into which modern humans expanded were not empty wilderness waiting to be claimed, but landscapes that bore the accumulated imprint of hundreds of thousands of years of Neanderthal occupation. Every valley and ridge, every river crossing and seasonal camp, every source of toolstone and reliable water had been known and used by Neanderthal communities across countless generations. The incoming modern humans were not discovering new lands so much as they were inserting themselves into human geographies that were already ancient, already shaped by long histories of occupation and use. This reality suggests that the early encounters between Neanderthals and modern humans took place within contexts that were far more complex than simple territorial displacement. Both groups were dealing with the same environmental pressures, exploiting many of the same resources and facing similar challenges in maintaining viable populations across landscapes that were constantly shifting in response to climate change. Their interactions were embedded within these shared struggles for survival rather than driven by abstract cultural or biological incompatibilities. The story that emerges from careful analysis of this contact period is not one of inevitable replacement, but of two closely related human lineages adapting to each other's presence while continuing to face the environmental and demographic challenges that affected all Ice Age populations. It was a story that would unfold across many millennia, involving episodes of avoidance and encounter, cooperation and competition, genetic exchange and cultural borrowing that created patterns of interaction far more nuanced than the dramatic narratives of conquest and replacement that have dominated popular understanding of this crucial period in human history. The reality of contact between Neanderthals and modern humans was almost certainly far more mundane than the dramatic encounters that capture our imagination. There were no summit meetings between tribal leaders, no formal treaties negotiated around ceremonial fires, no moments of mutual recognition that two different kinds of humanity had found each other in the vast wilderness of Ice Age Eurasia. Instead, the intersection of these two lineages played out in ways that were probably invisible to the participants themselves, through the quiet rhythms of seasonal movement, the cautious avoidance of occupied territories, and the gradual accumulation of signs that others were sharing the same demanding landscapes. Picture the reality as it most likely unfolded: a Neanderthal group arriving at a familiar campsite to find cold hearths that contained unfamiliar charcoal, stone tool fragments that had been made using techniques they did not recognize, and butchery patterns on scattered bones that suggested different approaches to processing game. There might have been no direct encounter at all, simply the recognition that others had been here recently, had used resources that the arriving group had also planned to exploit, and had moved on to destinations unknown. Such moments of indirect contact could have been repeated hundreds or thousands of times across the long centuries of coexistence, creating a web of mutual awareness that never required face-to-face meetings. The landscapes where these interactions took place were not divided by clear boundaries or formal territories in any sense that we would recognize. Both Neanderthal and modern human groups were highly mobile, following seasonal rounds that took them through varied environments, as resources became available and environmental conditions shifted. Their movements created overlapping patterns of land use that resembled what ecologists call mosaic territories, complex, shifting arrangements where different groups might use the same areas at different times of year, or exploit different resources within the same region, or follow routes that intersected at key locations like river crossings or mountain passes. Archaeological evidence for such patterns of alternating occupation is necessarily subtle and easily missed. A site might show layers of occupation that represent different groups using the same location across extended periods, but distinguishing between cultural traditions and determining the relationships between different occupants requires careful analysis of tool technologies, settlement patterns, and the countless small details that differentiate one human group from another. Even when such differences can be identified, connecting them to broader patterns of interaction or avoidance remains a matter of cautious inference rather than definitive proof. The absence of evidence presents particular challenges for understanding these contact patterns. Archaeological sites preserve only a tiny fraction of the activities that took place on ancient landscapes. Most campsites leave no permanent trace. Most encounters between groups, whether peaceful or hostile, would not result in deposits that could survive 40,000 years of weathering, erosion, and subsequent human activity. The sites that do preserve evidence of human occupation represent special circumstances. Caves that provided long-term shelter, locations with unusual preservation conditions, or places where particularly durable materials accumulated over extended periods. This preservation bias means that our understanding of Neanderthal modern human interactions is inevitably skewed toward the exceptional rather than the typical. We find evidence of the places where groups established semi-permanent camps, where they processed large game animals, where they manufactured stone tools in quantity. But the daily movements, the casual encounters, the brief camps that left no lasting trace, all of this ordinary reality of mobile life remains largely invisible to archaeological investigation. The question of cultural exchange between these groups illustrates the challenges of working with such limited evidence. There are hints in the archaeological record that suggest possible borrowing of techniques, adoption of new technologies, or influence flowing between different human populations. Some Neanderthal sites from later periods show tool technologies that resemble those associated with modern human groups. Some early modern human sites contain implements that seem to reflect influence from Neanderthal traditions. But establishing definitive cases of cultural transmission requires evidence that is often ambiguous and always open to alternative interpretations. Independent invention represents a constant alternative explanation for apparent similarities between different groups. When two populations face similar environmental challenges and possess similar cognitive capabilities, they may develop similar solutions without any direct contact or cultural exchange. Distinguishing between borrowing and parallel invention requires detailed analysis of technological sequences, geographical distributions, and temporal patterns that can be extremely difficult to establish from fragmentary archaeological evidence. The interactions that did occur were embedded within the practical realities of survival in demanding environments. Both groups were dealing with the same climatic pressures, exploiting many of the same resources, and facing similar challenges in maintaining viable populations. Their encounters, when they happened, were probably shaped more by immediate practical concerns, access to water, hunting territories, toolstone sources, seasonal camps, than by abstract cultural curiosity or hostility based on group differences. In this context, avoidance may have been as common as direct interaction, and perhaps more adaptive for both groups. Small populations operating close to the margins of survival could not afford the risks associated with conflict, but they also could not afford to share scarce resources with competitors. Maintaining some distance while monitoring each other's activities may have been the optimal strategy for groups that recognized each other as potential threats, but also as sources of valuable information about environmental conditions, resource availability, and successful survival strategies. The long ordinary reality of contact was probably characterized by this kind of cautious awareness. Groups that knew of each other's existence, that adapted their movements and activities to account for each other's presence, but that rarely came together in the direct encounters that would leave clear, archaeological signatures for modern researchers to discover and interpret. In the most intimate chapters of human history, the ones that unfold not in the grand sweep of migrations or the drama of technological innovation, but in the quiet moments when individuals from different communities encountered each other across the uncertain boundaries of Ice Age territories, something remarkable occurred. It was not the stuff of legend or epic narrative, but something far more fundamental and perhaps more moving. Two closely related human lineages, shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of separate evolutionary history, found each other attractive enough, familiar enough, human enough to forge the most personal connections possible between members of different populations. The genetic evidence for this ancient intimacy has emerged slowly from the patient analysis of DNA extracted from both ancient bones and modern populations. What it reveals challenges the stark narratives of replacement and extinction that have dominated discussions of Neanderthal disappearance. Instead of a story of one people simply displacing another, the molecular record tells a more complex tale of genetic integration that played out across several thousand years of coexistence. This was not conquest, but confluence, the gradual blending of lineages that had diverged deep in the past, but remained similar enough to produce viable offspring together. The timing of this genetic exchange appears to have been concentrated within a relatively narrow window of opportunity, roughly between 50,500 and 43,500 years ago, with the peak period of integration occurring around 47,000 years in the past. These dates, derived from sophisticated statistical analyses of genetic variation in modern populations, represent periods when modern human groups expanding into Eurasian territories encountered Neanderthal populations that had occupied these same regions for hundreds of millennia. The process appears to have been neither systematic nor universal, but rather patchy and opportunistic, occurring when and where circumstances brought individuals from different populations into close enough contact for romantic relationships to develop. Some modern human populations that entered Europe and Western Asia may have had little or no genetic contact with Neanderthal groups. Others may have experienced significant periods of interaction and genetic exchange. The patterns that emerge from genetic analysis suggest a complex mosaic of contact and isolation that varied significantly across both geography and time. What resulted from these ancient encounters was not a simple blending of characteristics, but a more complex process of genetic integration, selection, and gradual modification that has continued to shape human populations across the 40,000 years since the last known Neanderthal communities disappeared. Some genetic variants derived from Neanderthal ancestors have persisted in modern populations and even increased in frequency, suggesting that they provided adaptive advantages in certain environments or contexts. These surviving genetic contributions are particularly prominent in regions related to immune system function, metabolism, and physical characteristics like skin and hair pigmentation. Other Neanderthal-derived genetic variants appear to have been gradually eliminated from modern human populations over time, suggesting that they may have been neutral or even slightly disadvantageous in the long term. This process, which geneticists call purging selection, has reduced the overall proportion of Neanderthal ancestry in modern populations from what it might have been initially, but has preserved those genetic contributions that proved beneficial for human survival and reproduction. The geographic distribution of Neanderthal genetic inheritance in modern populations tells its own story about the history of human migration and interaction. Populations with ancestry primarily from sub-Saharan Africa, where modern humans evolved and where Neanderthals never established populations, carry little or no Neanderthal genetic material, but populations with significant ancestry from Europe, Asia, and other regions where Neanderthals once lived often carry substantial genetic contributions from these ancient cousins, typically ranging from 1 to 4% of their total genetic inheritance. This genetic legacy represents something more profound than simple biological inheritance. It serves as a permanent reminder that the boundaries between human populations have always been more porous than our categories suggest. That the history of human diversity involves not just separation and divergence, but also reconnection and integration. The Neanderthal genetic variants that persist in modern populations are not museum pieces preserved from a vanished past, but active participants in ongoing human evolution, continuing to influence our biology and our adaptation to changing environments. Yet it would be a mistake to interpret this genetic continuity as meaning that Neanderthals simply became modern humans, or that their disappearance as distinct populations was somehow not real. Genetic ancestry and cultural identity are not the same thing. The persistence of Neanderthal genetic contributions in modern populations does not negate the reality that Neanderthal communities, with their distinctive technologies, social arrangements, and ways of life, vanished from the Earth around 40,000 years ago. What survived was a portion of their biological inheritance, integrated into populations that developed along very different cultural and technological trajectories. The story of Neanderthal modern human genetic integration offers a different model for thinking about how human populations have interacted throughout history. It suggests that extinction need not always be absolute, that the end of distinct populations can involve transformation and inheritance rather than simple disappearance. It reminds us that the boundaries between human groups have always been permeable that love and attraction have repeatedly crossed the lines that separate populations, and that the history of humanity is written not just in the grand movements of peoples across continents, but in the intimate personal choices made by individuals who found each other human enough to share their lives and their genetic legacy with partners from different worlds. In this quiet story of ancient attraction and genetic inheritance, we find a form of comfort that the starker narratives of replacement and extinction cannot provide. The Neanderthals are gone, but not entirely. They live on in microscopic fragments scattered through the genomes of their distant descendants, a permanent reminder that human history is not just about the survival of the fittest, but about the persistence of connection across even the deepest divisions that time and evolution can create. When we search for explanations for the disappearance of Neanderthal populations, our modern minds often reach first for dramatic narratives that mirror the conflicts and conquests that dominate recorded history. We imagine prehistoric battlefields where technologically superior modern humans overwhelmed their ancient cousins through superior weapons or military organization. We construct scenarios of systematic displacement, deliberate extermination, or sudden catastrophic defeats that cleared entire territories of their original inhabitants. These visions satisfy our appetite for clear causes and decisive outcomes, but they may tell us more about our own assumptions about how history unfolds than about the actual processes that shaped human populations in Ice Age Eurasia. The reality revealed by careful analysis of population dynamics suggests a very different kind of story, one where competition operated not through dramatic confrontations, but through the quiet mathematics of demographic advantage accumulated across many generations. This is competition without battlefields, replacement without conquest, extinction that emerges not from single catastrophic events, but from the gradual accumulation of small differences in survival and reproductive success over extended periods. It is a process that operates according to principles that can seem counterintuitive to minds accustomed to thinking about competition in terms of direct contest and immediate outcomes. Consider how small advantages in population dynamics can compound over time to produce large effects. If one group maintains a slightly higher birth rate, or experiences slightly lower infant mortality, or proves slightly more successful at establishing new communities in marginal territories, these modest differences may be barely visible from generation to generation. But across the centuries and millennia that characterize prehistoric timescales, such advantages can produce exponential differences in population size and territorial occupation. Modern computer models that attempt to simulate the dynamics of competing human populations during the late Pleistocene have revealed just how sensitive these systems can be to relatively minor differences in key demographic parameters. A population that maintains an average annual growth rate just a fraction of a percentage point higher than its competitors will, given enough time, come to dominate the shared landscape, even if both groups began with similar numbers and capabilities. This is not conquest in any meaningful sense, but mathematical inevitability operating across timescales that dwarf human planning and intention. The demographic advantages that modern human populations may have possessed over their Neanderthal contemporaries need not have been dramatic to prove decisive over the long term. Slightly larger group sizes might have made it easier to weather the inevitable crises that affected all Ice Age populations: harsh winters, failed hunts, outbreaks of disease, or accidents that removed key members from small communities. More extensive social networks might have provided access to information about environmental conditions across wider territories, allowing more efficient responses to climate changes or resource fluctuations. Greater population density might have accelerated the development and transmission of technological innovations, creating positive feedback loops where larger numbers of individuals contributed to solving survival challenges, and where successful solutions spread more rapidly through more connected populations. These advantages would have been subtle, often invisible to the participants themselves, but cumulatively powerful in their long-term effects on population growth and territorial expansion. The process of competitive replacement in such systems does not require conscious hostility or systematic displacement of existing populations. Indeed, it can occur even when the competing groups maintain generally peaceful relationships and avoid direct conflicts over resources. If one population consistently proves slightly more successful at establishing new settlements, slightly better at recovering from demographic setbacks, or slightly more capable of adapting to environmental changes, it will gradually come to occupy a larger proportion of the available habitable territory. Existing populations may find themselves increasingly marginalized, not through direct displacement, but through the gradual occupation of previously unoccupied areas by their more numerous competitors. They may discover that their traditional seasonal rounds now intersect with territories claimed by other groups, forcing them to modify migration patterns that had been successful for generations. They may encounter increased competition for the seasonal resources, migrating herds, fish runs, toolstone sources that their survival strategies had always assumed would be available when needed. This kind of competitive pressure operates most powerfully on populations that are already under stress from other factors. Groups that have been weakened by climatic pressures, reduced to small numbers by environmental changes, or isolated from mutual support networks become increasingly vulnerable to any additional challenges that their more numerous competitors might inadvertently create. What begins as peaceful coexistence in a landscape with abundant resources can gradually transform into unsustainable competition as population growth reduces the carrying capacity available to each group. The mathematical models that explore these dynamics consistently demonstrate that replacement can occur without requiring any assumption of technological, cognitive, or organizational superiority on the part of the successful population. Numbers alone, if sustained over sufficient time, can prove decisive regardless of other factors. This is not a morality tale about the triumph of superior peoples, but a reminder that success in demographic competition is often unrelated to merit, capability, or adaptive excellence in any absolute sense. The Neanderthals were not inferior to their modern human contemporaries in any meaningful sense, but they may have been fewer. They may have faced demographic challenges that their competitors avoided, lived in smaller groups that were more vulnerable to random setbacks, or maintained social networks that were less extensive and therefore less resilient during periods of stress. In the patient mathematics of population growth and territorial occupation, these modest disadvantages could have been sufficient to tip the balance toward an outcome that no individual participant intended or anticipated. The gradual fading away of communities that had successfully inhabited European and Western Asian landscapes for hundreds of thousands of years. Among the most unsettling possibilities that researchers have begun to explore in recent years are the threats that leave no archaeological trace, the invisible dangers that could have shaped the fate of Neanderthal populations without creating any evidence that modern science could easily discover or interpret. These are the quiet killers that operate through biology rather than violence, through microscopic interactions rather than dramatic confrontations, through the subtle vulnerabilities that emerge when closely related but long-separated populations encounter each other after hundreds of thousands of years of independent evolution. The hypothesis that disease played a role in Neanderthal extinction requires us to think about pathogen transmission in ways that can feel uncomfortably familiar to our modern experience. When populations that have been isolated from each other for long periods come into contact, they may carry different suites of infectious diseases, different immune system adaptations, and different levels of resistance to pathogens that have been circulating in distant regions. What represents a manageable health challenge for one group, a seasonal illness that causes temporary discomfort but rarely proves fatal, might become a devastating epidemic when introduced to populations that lack the evolutionary history of exposure and adaptation. Modern humans expanding from Africa into Eurasian territories would have brought with them the pathogen environment of their ancestral homelands, including diseases that had co-evolved with human populations across tens of thousands of years of African habitation. These might have included viral infections, bacterial diseases, or parasitic organisms that posed little threat to the populations that had lived with them for millennia, but could have proven catastrophic when transmitted to Neanderthal communities that had never encountered similar challenges. The reverse transmission could have been equally problematic. Neanderthal populations, after hundreds of thousands of years of European and Western Asian residence, would have developed their own relationships with local pathogens, their own immune system adaptations to regional disease environments, their own biological accommodations with the microscopic threats that characterized their particular landscapes. These regional disease complexes might have posed serious challenges to modern human populations, attempting to establish themselves in territories where they lacked the immunological experience that successful residents required. Such disease-based explanations for population replacement operate according to principles that can seem almost invisibly simple yet devastatingly effective. A pathogen that reduces fertility rates by even modest percentages, or increases infant mortality by relatively small amounts, or creates periodic epidemics that disproportionately affect adults in their reproductive years, can have demographic consequences that compound across generations to produce population declines that eventually become irreversible. These effects need not be dramatic or immediately obvious to prove decisive over the long term. Recent research into the genetic compatibility between Neanderthal and modern human populations has raised additional questions about more subtle forms of biological incompatibility. Some studies suggest that hybrid offspring between these two lineages might have faced reproductive challenges that reduced their evolutionary fitness compared to individuals with more uniform ancestry. Male hybrid offspring, in particular, might have experienced reduced fertility or other reproductive disadvantages that would have limited the long-term genetic contribution of mixed ancestry individuals to subsequent generations. These genetic incompatibility hypotheses remain highly speculative and are actively debated among researchers, but they point toward the kinds of subtle, biological barriers that could have influenced population dynamics without creating obvious archaeological signatures. If hybrid individuals were less successful at reproduction, or if mixed ancestry populations faced health challenges that reduced their survival rates, these factors could have created gradual pressures that favored genetic homogeneity over the long term, while still allowing for the limited gene flow that genetic evidence suggests occurred between these populations. The cumulative effect of multiple small biological pressures operating simultaneously could have been far more significant than any single factor operating in isolation. A population already stressed by climate variability and demographic fragmentation might have been particularly vulnerable to additional challenges from disease exposure, reproductive incompatibilities, or immune system mismatches. Small reductions in fertility, combined with modest increases in mortality, combined with occasional epidemic events, combined with the challenges of maintaining viable populations in marginal environments, could have created a cascade of demographic problems that gradually overwhelmed the adaptive capabilities of even the most resilient communities. These biological hypotheses for Neanderthal extinction are appealing partly because they help explain why the disappearance of these populations appears to have been gradual rather than sudden, patchy rather than uniform, and variable in its timing across different regions. If biological factors were involved, we would expect to see exactly the kind of complex, regionally variable pattern of decline that the archaeological record seems to preserve. Different populations might have faced different combinations of challenges, experienced different levels of contact with potential disease vectors, or possessed different degrees of biological compatibility with their modern human contemporaries. Yet we must approach these explanations with the same caution that good science demands for all hypotheses about events that occurred so far in the past and left so little direct evidence. The absence of preserved pathogens, the impossibility of conducting controlled experiments on ancient populations, and the complex interactions between biological, environmental, and cultural factors make it extremely difficult to evaluate the relative importance of disease, genetic incompatibility, or other biological pressures in shaping the ultimate fate of Neanderthal communities. What these hypotheses do provide is a reminder that extinction need not always result from dramatic external pressures or obvious adaptive failures. Sometimes the most decisive factors in determining the survival or disappearance of populations are the ones that operate beneath the threshold of visibility, through processes so subtle and gradual that even the participants might not have recognized the dangers they faced until it was far too late to respond effectively. As the long twilight of Neanderthal presence in Europe drew toward its close, the surviving communities found themselves increasingly concentrated in the kinds of places that had always served as refuges during times of environmental stress. These were the southern peninsulas and coastal enclaves where Mediterranean climates provided some buffer against the harshest effects of northern cooling, where complex topographies created microclimates that could support human life even when vast territories to the north had become uninhabitable, where limestone caves offered reliable shelter and proximity to the sea ensured access to resources that remained available even when terrestrial environments became impoverished. The most famous and perhaps most poignant of these final refuges lies at the very southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula, where the limestone cliffs of Gibraltar rise abruptly from the waters that separate Europe from Africa. Here, In a sea-facing cave that the modern world knows as Gorham's Cave, archaeologists have uncovered evidence that tells a story both hopeful and heartbreaking, the story of what may have been among the very last Neanderthal communities to maintain their presence on a continent that their ancestors had called home for hundreds of thousands of years. The cave itself occupies a position that would have been especially favourable during the challenging conditions of the late Pleistocene. Its opening faces southeast toward the warming sun and the relatively temperate waters of the Mediterranean. Its interior chambers provided reliable shelter from wind and weather, while remaining spacious enough to accommodate the social activities that kept small groups cohesive across the long months of winter. Most importantly, its location at the interface between land and sea offered access to a diversity of resources that could sustain human life even when other environments were under severe stress. The archaeological deposits within Gorham's Cave preserve layers of human occupation that extend deep into the past, creating a record of repeated use across tens of thousands of years. But it is the uppermost levels of this sequence that have generated the most intense scientific interest and debate, for they appear to contain evidence of Neanderthal presence at dates far later than most researchers had previously considered possible. When these deposits were first analysed and published in the early years of the 21st century, they seemed to suggest that Neanderthal communities had survived in this coastal refuge until perhaps 28,000 years ago, a date that would extend their presence on Earth by thousands of years beyond what had been documented at any other site. The implications of such late survival were profound and deeply moving. If accurate, these dates would mean that Neanderthal communities had persisted through the worst phases of the last glacial maximum, had witnessed the expansion of modern human populations across most of Europe, and had maintained their distinctive way of life in this marginal refuge long after their relatives elsewhere had vanished from the archaeological record. It would mean that the extinction of the Neanderthals was not a single event that swept across Europe in a matter of centuries, but a gradual process of contraction and retreat that played out across many millennia. But extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the dating of the latest Neanderthal occupation at Gorham's Cave has been subject to intense scrutiny and ongoing revision. The technical challenges of dating archaeological materials from this period are formidable, particularly when dealing with organic remains that have been subject to tens of thousands of years of potential contamination, mixing and reworking. Small amounts of more recent carbon-bearing materials infiltrating ancient deposits can produce dates that are far too young, while the reuse of cave spaces across long periods can create complex stratigraphic situations where materials of different ages become mixed together in ways that can mislead even the most careful analysis. Subsequent research and reanalysis have suggested that the youngest reliable dates for Neanderthal presence at Gorham's Cave may be somewhat older than the original dramatic claim suggested. Current scientific consensus tends to place the last known Neanderthal occupation of this site at around 32,000 years ago, still remarkably late in comparison to sites elsewhere in Europe, but not quite the stunning extension of survival that earlier interpretations had proposed. This process of scientific revision and refinement illustrates one of the fundamental challenges that archaeologists face when attempting to identify the final moments of vanished peoples. The last appearance of characteristic artifacts or cultural remains in archaeological deposits does not necessarily represent the actual moment of extinction. There may have been later occupations that left no preserved traces, or whose traces were destroyed by subsequent geological processes, or that occurred in locations that have not yet been discovered or excavated by modern researchers. The distinction between last archaeological appearance and actual biological extinction is crucial for understanding what happened to the Neanderthals, but it is also inherently frustrating for those of us who seek definitive answers to historical questions. We may never be able to identify the precise moment when the last Neanderthal community ceased to exist, or the exact location where the final members of this ancient lineage drew their last breaths. What we can document are the latest reliable traces of their presence, the final echoes of lives that were lived and then faded into the silence of deep time. Even if the most dramatic claims for late survival at Gorham's Cave cannot be sustained, the site remains a powerful symbol of resilience and adaptation in the face of overwhelming challenges. Here, at the edge of a continent that had become increasingly inhospitable to their way of life, small groups of Neanderthals maintained their presence for as long as environmental conditions and demographic realities allowed. They continued to make tools, to hunt and gather, to maintain the social bonds that kept their communities alive, until finally even this most favourable refuge could no longer sustain human life, organised according to their ancient patterns. The image that emerges is both melancholy and inspiring, the last footprints slowly erased by the advancing tide. In the landscapes where Neanderthal communities once gathered around evening fires, where they shaped stone tools and cared for their injured, where they raised children and buried their dead, a profound silence settled. It was not the temporary quiet of seasonal migration or the brief absence of groups moving through familiar territories, but the permanent stillness that comes when an entire way of being human has vanished from the world forever. The caves remained, the stone tool scatters endured, the hearth sites preserved their ancient carbon. But the voices that had once given meaning to these places were gone, leaving behind only the material fragments from which later peoples would attempt to reconstruct lives they had never witnessed. For tens of thousands of years after the last Neanderthal communities disappeared, these traces lay undisturbed beneath accumulating sediments and the debris of later occupations. Occasionally, perhaps, a modern human hunter might have noticed unusually worked stones or curious bone fragments weathering from a riverbank or exposed by erosion from a hillside, but such discoveries would have carried no special meaning beyond their immediate utility or curiosity. There was no context within which to understand these objects as the remains of different kinds of people, no framework for interpreting them as evidence of vanished human worlds. The systematic rediscovery of the Neanderthals began only in the middle of the 19th century, when European quarry workers and amateur naturalists started to uncover skeletal remains that did not fit comfortably within existing categories of human variation. These were bones that were clearly human in their general form and proportions, but different enough from modern anatomy to provoke uncomfortable questions about the nature and history of humanity itself. The famous discovery in the Neander Valley of Germany in 1856 provided the name that would eventually be applied to all members of this ancient lineage, but it also initiated more than a century of misunderstanding, misinterpretation, and gradual correction that continues to shape how we think about human diversity and human evolution. The first scientific interpretations of Neanderthal remains reflected the prejudices and limitations of 19th century European thought more clearly than they illuminated the reality of ancient lives. Early researchers, working with fragmentary evidence and theoretical frameworks that assumed linear progression from primitive to advanced forms of humanity, constructed images of Neanderthals that emphasized their apparent differences from modern humans while minimizing their similarities. They became the archetypal cavemen of popular imagination, brutish, stooped, intellectually limited beings who represented an early stage in humanity's climb towards civilization. These caricatures proved remarkably persistent, surviving well into the 20th century despite accumulating evidence that contradicted their basic assumptions. The Neanderthals of museum displays and popular culture became frozen in poses of primitive aggression, clutching crude clubs and dragging their knuckles as they shambled through landscapes that served mainly as backdrops for the eventual triumph of more advanced peoples. They were denied the complexity, the intelligence, and the humanity that careful analysis of their remains clearly demonstrated, becoming instead projections of modern anxieties about our own evolutionary past. The process of correction has been slow, uneven, and often incomplete. As archaeological techniques became more sophisticated and more evidence accumulated, researchers gradually constructed more nuanced and respectful interpretations of Neanderthal capabilities and achievements. The crude brutes of early imagination were replaced by increasingly complex pictures of people who made sophisticated tools, controlled fire, cared for their disabled, and possibly engaged in symbolic behaviours that resembled those of modern humans. But this revision brought its own risks, as some researchers swung toward romanticization that was as distorting as the earlier primitivism had been. The famous flower burial at Shanidar Cave serves as a perfect example of how our desire to find familiar humanity in ancient peoples can shape our interpretation of ambiguous evidence. When pollen analysis suggested that one Neanderthal individual had been buried with flowers, the discovery was embraced as proof of sophisticated emotional and spiritual lives that mirrored our own. The image of grieving relatives gathering wildflowers to honour their dead was deeply moving, and seemed to confirm that Neanderthals shared the capacity for symbolic thought and ritual behaviour that we consider essentially human. But as we have seen, subsequent analysis suggested that the pollen concentrations might have natural rather than human origins, and the flower burial became a cautionary tale about the dangers of interpreting the past through the lens of our own expectations and desires. It reminded researchers that archaeology requires not just technical skill and scientific rigour, but also intellectual humility and ethical responsibility toward the people whose lives we attempt to reconstruct from fragmentary evidence. Modern scientific institutions have gradually developed more balanced and respectful approaches to presenting Neanderthal research to the public. They describe these ancient people as our closest evolutionary relatives, acknowledge their sophisticated behaviours and technologies, and recognise the geographic and temporal diversity that characterised Neanderthal populations across their long history. They avoid both the primitive caricatures of earlier eras and the romantic projections that can be equally misleading, striving instead for presentations that honour both the evidence and the humanity of the people behind it. This ongoing process of revision and refinement serves as a reminder that archaeology is not simply the objective recovery of ancient facts, but an interpretive discipline that reflects the perspectives and limitations of the people who practice it. Every generation of researchers brings new techniques, new theoretical frameworks, and new assumptions to the study of the past, and each generation's interpretations reveal as much about their own time and culture as they do about the ancient peoples they study. The power to define the vanished carries with it profound responsibility, the obligation to speak carefully and honestly for people who can no longer speak for themselves. As we reach the end of this long journey through the vanished world of the Neanderthals, we arrive not at a place of simple answers or dramatic conclusions, but at a quiet space of reflection, where the complexity of the past meets the humility that all honest inquiry eventually demands. The story we have followed across 20 chapters and hundreds of thousands of years resists the clean narratives that our minds prefer, the clear causes and decisive moments that would make the disappearance of an entire human lineage easier to understand and accept. Instead, what we have found is something more subtle and perhaps more true, a tale of gradual pressures, accumulated vulnerabilities, and the kind of slow-motion tragedy that unfolds across timescales too vast for any individual participants to comprehend. The Neanderthals did not fail because they were primitive, crude, or evolutionarily inferior to the modern human populations that eventually replaced them. They were not swept aside by dramatically superior technologies, conquered by more intelligent rivals, or eliminated by some single catastrophic weakness that made their extinction inevitable. Rather, they were a successful human adaptation that had thrived for hundreds of thousands of years in the demanding environments of Ice Age Eurasia, developing sophisticated solutions to the challenges of survival in a world that tested every aspect of human capability and endurance. Their eventual disappearance appears to have resulted from the intersection of multiple pressures that operated simultaneously across different regions and timescales. Climate change fragmented their populations and reduced the carrying capacity of familiar territories. Demographic isolation created genetic bottlenecks that weakened their long-term viability. The arrival of modern human competitors introduced new forms of pressure through resource competition and possibly through disease transmission or other biological factors. Small population sizes made them vulnerable to random catastrophes and reduced their ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions. None of these factors alone would necessarily have proven fatal to communities that had weathered countless previous crises, but together, operating across centuries and millennia, they created a web of challenges that gradually overwhelmed even the most resilient Neanderthal populations. The process appears to have been neither sudden nor uniform, but rather a complex pattern of local extinctions and temporary survivals that played out differently across the vast territories these people had once occupied. Yet even in extinction, the Neanderthals achieved a form of continuity that offers some measure of comfort to those of us who are moved by their story. The genetic analysis that has revolutionized our understanding of human evolution reveals that they did not vanish completely from the world, but rather dissolved partially into the expanding populations of modern humans with whom they shared those final millennia of coexistence. The children born of unions between these two human lineages carried forward genetic contributions from both ancestries, creating a legacy that persists today in the genomes of billions of people whose daily lives unfold unconscious of their ancient inheritance. This genetic continuity does not negate the reality of Neanderthal extinction, as distinct populations with their own cultures, technologies, and ways of organizing human life around the fundamental challenges of existence. But it does remind us that the boundaries between human groups have always been more porous than our categories suggest, that the history of our species involves not just separation and competition, but also connection and integration across lines that seemed absolute to contemporary observers, but proved permeable to the deeper currents of human attraction and biological compatibility. The lessons embedded in the Neanderthal story extend far beyond the specific circumstances of their disappearance. In their long success and eventual vanishing, we see reflected the fundamental vulnerabilities that affect all human populations: the dependence on environmental stability, the risks inherent in small group sizes, the challenges of adapting to rapid change, and the unpredictable interactions between biological, cultural, and environmental factors that shape the fate of communities across time. Their story serves as a reminder that dominance is always temporary, that adaptation is never a guarantee of permanent survival, and that intelligence and sophistication offer no protection against the larger forces that govern life on a changing planet. In the end, the Neanderthals represent both cautionary tale and source of comfort. Their extinction reminds us of the fragility of all human achievements and the impermanence of all human arrangements. But their long persistence and partial continuity suggest that resilience, creativity, and the capacity for connection can endure across even the deepest transformations. They lived, they adapted, they cared for each other, and they left traces that connect us still to ways of being human that we can barely imagine but cannot entirely forget. In the molecular fragments of their genetic legacy, and in the stone tools that still emerge from ancient sediments, they remain present in a world that has moved far beyond the landscapes they once called home, but not beyond the reach of the questions. Their lives continue to pose about what it means to be human in an uncertain world.